In this video, I'm going to be talking about chapter 2. Now, what I'm going to do is record this on my desktop first, just so I have kind of a larger screen to work with here as I'm talking about things. Um, but I won't be able to draw anything out, draw out any numbers. So if I feel during the lecture that there's equations I need to write out or anything like that, I'll make a separate video that goes through those things. So in chapter 2, what we're talking about here is the thing that macroeconomists care a great deal about, which would be data, and more specifically, that they care about three things. They care about production, they care about prices, and they care about unemployment. Now, it turns out during this era of COVID that we got a lot of really interesting things going on here. Um, let's give you some examples here. So this is from today's Wall Street Journal. So that would be Friday, August 27th. Um, and one of the things that COVID has caused is some supply chain problems, meaning that, the flow of goods from input producers, on and on down the line. And as a consequence, right, and we see that in things like semiconductors, semiconductor plants shutting down, which then causes automobiles to be more expensive because they can't get these semiconductors, or just or because companies have to do more like cleaning and whatnot, and COVID restrictions, it makes their business operations more expensive. Well, all of this is combining to raise prices. Something that even in my lifetime, I'm 44 years old. I would have to think back to when I was about 3 years old to think about the last time there was significant inflation in the United States, 1979. And before you think there's no way, Scheiding, you remember it from when you were 3 years old, I do in fact remember the concept, at least of higher prices and the consequences that it has, because the consequence that it had, I grew up on the mainland. The consequence that it had was, my father becoming um, unemployed because of it, because companies stopped buying the products that he helped manufacture. Um, in this article here, then the White House then is estimating that consumer prices are going to go up 4.8% higher from a year earlier. That's hugely significant. Um, the normal inflation numbers that we're talking about would be 2% is generally the stated goal for inflation. 4.8% is dramatic. And the problem that it causes, um, is that um, wages don't increase that quickly, and that the other problem would be is that firms might be reluctant to pass on higher prices. So, um, inflation then causes other problems where people like stockpile on goods because they think that products are going to become more expensive the longer they wait to buy it, right? So this would explain why everyone seems to be buying a house right now, because everyone thinks that houses are going to become more expensive. What the debate is right now, and this is a little bit of what this article talks about here, is economists are actually split on whether the inflation is real or not. By that I mean there's some uncertainty about whether what's happening is transitory. Is it going to last? Um, it's just uncertain. Um, is it the case that, you know, COVID starts to ease up and eventually all the supply chain problems start to fix themselves? Or is it that we live in now a permanently higher um, priced world after COVID? I don't know. Personally, and I would argue most economists don't really know. Um, that's really the debate. And the reason why then there's a debate is because the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the United States, has to figure out um, if it's temporary or permanent. If it's temporary, then the Federal Reserve doesn't need to do anything about it, right? They can just let the process work its way out. But if it's real and if it's permanent, then the only solution to high inflation is to actually cool the economy down, meaning to reduce the amount of stimulus. And that's pretty dramatic. The last time we saw again that happen was 1980, when 1979, 1980, when Paul Volcker became the Federal Reserve Chairman, and as a consequence, dramatically slowed the economy down. My father lost his job because of that slowing down of the economy, but what it did is it helped reduce inflation. Now, that inflation, the way that we see that is that my parents got a mortgage in 1979. Um, my father served in the military, and he got a VA loan, so that's a pretty cheap, inexpensive loan. And that mortgage in 1979 had an interest rate, and my parents had relatively good credit scores and whatnot. The interest rate was 16%. 16%. And it's not unusual to hear of, grandparents and whatnot that were buying, certificates of deposit from the bank that paid like 8% interest, 9% interest. It's just unheard of today that you'd be able to find such a thing. So, what Jerry Powell, the current Federal Reserve Chairman, really has to consider here now with this inflation is, does he need to cool the economy down? That's at least what he's saying today. You can kind of see this here in this part that I'm highlighting right here. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerry Powell used most of the speech to explain why he believed this year's inflation surge would prove temporary and why he doesn't need to tighten monetary policy, meaning reduce the amount of stimulus, basically cool the economy down. It's good that he feels confident about that. I'm just not sure that the data doesn't really tell us either way whether he's correct or not. We just don't know. Oh, I kind of want to watch this. Sure, why not? Let's. Let me make sure here that it's going to. I can't tell if it's going to record. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if it's going to share the audio with you or not. Let's just try it and see.
The Lexus IS. All in on the sports sedan. Experience amazing at your Lexus dealer.
I haven't watched this video. I'm not sure I want to watch 7 minutes, but let's just see this here.
Inflation. It's the word that's been on everyone's lips lately, and some are looking back at history.
In fact, we've not heard inflation talked this much since really the 1970s.
Dude, I just said that.
The past few months, prices for everything from gasoline to groceries have been rising sharply as the economy roars back from the pandemic recession. This graph charts the Consumer Price Index, a metric that measures...
Now, right there, What you're seeing going on right here is during World War II, you've got this dramatic increase in prices because most of the production was being allocated to war goods rather than consumer goods. Then soldiers come back after the war and they're like, geez, like fantastic, I survived the war. And they get married, they have kids, they buy a house, they buy a car. And so you see a dramatic inflation there.
The average change in prices for consumer goods and services compared to a year ago.
And then you see that right here. You see these twin peaks right here during the as the U.S. exits Vietnam, and you get this end of the Nixon administration. And then you also what's happening right here. This would be the oil crisis, the twin OPEC embargoes. And then look, really, since my entire lifetime, I was born in 77, so somewhere around right there, all of your lifetime, it's been relatively stable and relatively flat. But the most dramatic thing happening is that you get some slight deflation, fall in prices in the 2008 2009 crisis. And actually, deflation is worse because you really don't have any mechanisms to control for falling prices. Falling prices, deflation only happens during severe economic problems like the Great Depression and, well, the 2008 2009 crisis.
Or more simply put, inflation. In May of this year, prices spiked 5% to reach the highest annual inflation rate in nearly 13 years. Many economists believe that a small amount of inflation, around 2%, is inevitable and even desirable.
I just said that.
That's essentially what we've had for the past 15 years before this most recent surge. But these recent increases have some fearing that the U.S. might be returning to the runaway inflation of the 1970s.
No one wants to see that happen again.
So, are we returning to the spiraling inflation of the late 1960s and 1970s? Or is today's inflation, as the Fed assures us,
That's Jerry Powell, Federal Reserve Chairman.
This is an extraordinarily unusual time.
For those old enough to remember it, the Great Inflation was a period in which the cost of living for millions of Americans soared. From 1965 to 1982, prices for food and everyday consumer items rose dramatically from 2% in 1962 to 15% in 1979. During that same period, unemployment also rose steadily, eventually reaching just above 10%. The term stagflation, an economic condition of both rising inflation and increasing unemployment, became the go-to phrase to describe the period's economic malaise. This was a time when consumers protested rising meat prices, union members picketed for cost of living pay increases, and long lines for unemployment and gas became commonplace.
Here in New Jersey, 10% of the workforce is unemployed. Across the nation, the average is 8%.
The main lesson from the 70s is that kind of nagging, persistent, recurrent double-digit inflation doesn't happen overnight. It sets in over many years. And it set in because of a long series of policy mistakes in Washington.
The Great Inflation has its roots in the government spending of the 1960s. Consumer prices began rising under President Johnson as he escalated the Vietnam War and launched his Great Society social programs. But the double-digit inflation the period is famous for didn't begin until President Richard Nixon took office.
The time has come for a new economic policy for the United States.
In 1971, Nixon ordered that the dollar would no longer be backed by gold.
Inflation robs every American, every one of you.
Nixon also influenced the Fed's monetary policy, pushing the central bank to pump more money into the economy.
That right there, what was said just there, is probably the most monumental thing that happened in the 20th century for the Federal Reserve Bank. Let me just rewind it again, just so you can hear that again, and then I'll talk about it.
robs every American, every one of you.
This part right here.
Nixon also influenced the Fed's monetary policy, pushing the central bank to pump more money into the economy and keep interest rates low.
That right there. So one of the things that we're going to learn this semester, and that maybe you would have had some introduction to in 131, is that the idea that politicians would influence the Federal Reserve Bank and what it decides to do is a big no-no. It just, you don't want it happening. Because let's think about what politicians want in this world, right? Well, besides, I don't know, what do politicians, I don't know very many politicians, right? But what do? They want to get reelected, right? That's what they always seem to want to do. That's politicians do what they got to do, and they want to get reelected. So how does a politician get reelected? If the economy is strong, right? Like them or dislike them, and you shouldn't care what I think, and I don't really care what you think. Well, it doesn't really matter. Again, you should not care what I think about this world. I wasn't a huge fan of the Trump administration, and one of the things that led me to believe before COVID happened that he probably would get reelected was that the economy was performing so strongly, right? Because it's just general human nature that you would want to keep things going good if they seem to be going good, right? So why would you change presidents if the economy is doing so well? It took a global pandemic for him to narrowly lose, which tells you a great deal about him as a politician. It says a great deal about the American electorate, but it also says a great deal about, again, how dangerous it can be if a politician tries to influence the Federal Reserve to keep stimulating the economy to make it seem really strong, which is what Nixon did. Nixon pushed, encouraged Arthur Burns, who was the Federal Reserve Chairman at that time, to keep stimulating the economy, even though it didn't need it. And the result was all this money exists in the economy, and then you get inflation. So that's also then why Jerry Powell has to make a decision right now. Has he stimulated the economy too much because of COVID and is causing the inflation? If he asks Biden what Biden thinks, Biden's going to be like, dude, just keep the money going. Keep things going. Things are weak. But the data does not suggest that Biden is correct. The data suggests that, if anything, there might be too much stimulus out there. Okay, let's just watch a little bit more here.
By letting inflation rise gradually for a number of years, the Fed compromised the trust the public held that the Fed would maintain price stability. Businesses and households started expecting that inflation would persist.
As prices went up, workers started pressing in part for unions, and as wages went up, companies started raising prices even more. And we got this game of leapfrog where prices and wages both went up.
We must whip inflation right now.
These policy missteps continued under President Ford. And later under President Carter, the issue was exacerbated further by OPEC's oil embargoes.
A more serious domestic problem. That problem is inflation.
It wouldn't be until President Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker.
Now look at Paul Volcker. That man is really tall. He's like 6'5". He's dead now. But this man right here, the man on the left, is the man who really saved the American economy in 1980. And he was Federal Reserve Chairman until 1987. when Alan Greenspan became Federal Reserve Chairman.
As the chairman of the Federal Reserve, that the great inflation finally began to disappear.
Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman, said, "I'm going to stop this cycle." And he clamped down on the growth of money supply and he jacked up interest rates. It caused two very severe recessions. But that had turned out to be really what needed to happen to get inflation under control.
Volcker's inflation crackdown represented a new chapter for America's monetary policy.
In the 1960s and 1970s, the Fed did not have an articulated inflation targeting strategy, that inflation should be around 2%. And so they were not focused on keeping inflation under control.
In the 1970s, the Fed was not even willing to commit to what they meant by price stability. It was kind of trust us, we will deliver, which is horrible policy.
Today, we can see some clear similarities between our modern inflationary period and that of the 1970s. Just like the 70s, prices are rising. The Federal Reserve has increased the money supply, and government spending is up. But comparing today's inflation with that of the entire Great Inflation, especially the 1970s, is not accurate.
I graduated from college in 1975. I had a front row seat. Nothing like that. I don't expect anything like that to happen.
Today's inflation and the threat that we have is actually like the last half of the 1960s. It's not like the 1970s. In the mid-1960s, inflation had been running about 2%. By the end of the 1960s, inflation went to about 5%. Right? The last inflation reading we had was still below 5%. And so you're nowhere near 20%, which was the highest inflation reading at the end of the 1970s. There's almost no period in the 1970s that had inflation as low as we have now.
Some of the recent spikes in inflation are a very healthy sign of the recovery. What we experienced last year wasn't normal. Take airfares in the airline industry. We had this dramatic drop of airfares that was a sign of the risk that the whole industry would collapse. It's a healthy sign that we see a reversal of those increases today.
For their part, the Fed says it remains committed to its long-held stance that today's inflation is temporary.
The Fed believes that we're having a supply shock, and so that's causing shortages and temporary price increases. That's the Fed's theory.
What we're seeing now, we believe, is inflation in particular categories of goods and services that are being directly affected by this unique historical event that none of us has lived through before, called reopening the economy after closing it.
Every time we have an economic recovery from a recession, we expect to see inflation rise above 2% for a while. That's normal.
It turns out that these impacts are more than transitory. If they're lasting, they persist or even increase, then the Fed might have to do something to stop it.
On June 16th, Federal Reserve officials signaled that they expect to raise interest rates by late 2023, sooner than they anticipated in March.
Okay, so yeah, that gives us an idea then of what's going on for inflation. Let's go back to the slides here now. Let me pause this very briefly here.